Hi folks, it's Tom at psychsafety.com here, and today we're going to be talking about work as done versus work as imagined. Why there is a difference between the two things. And in fact we're going to dive into some other work as varieties as well, some other archetypes of work such as work as prescribed, work as disclosed, and things like that. Now, there's an article on our website about this, so if you Google work as imagined versus work as done, you'll probably get to that, and there's some deeper dive there and some graphics that you can have a look at. Now, but let's define what we mean by work is done and work is imagined. Let's start with work is imagined. Work is imagined is the way we imagine work is done. It's what we perceive work to be, and it's often idealized. It's often without mistakes. We don't imagine. I mean, we might imagine ourselves making mistakes, but we don't. We're probably less likely to imagine someone else making mistakes, particularly if they're an expert, right? Work is imagined is often a bit distant from real world constraints, and particularly the further we are from the front line, the sharp end, the real world of doing work. There's a concept in tech known as ideal dev days, because it's a sort of recognition that we might, if you ask someone how long might it take to develop this code or write this code, they'll say, oh, it might take a day, 2 days, but that's of course an ideal day where you actually have a full day to do it and you're not drawn into meetings, you're not distracted by someone else who needs help or something going wrong or something like that. We often imagine this perfect scenario, and that's not the real world, right? There's a tendency towards optimism bias and missing the real world, the real complexity of the real world. And often when you look at standard operating procedures and compliance documents and things that describe how to do the work, they sort of represent this optimistic view of the world, this maybe slightly simplistic view of the world. And so that represents work as prescribed. Work is prescribed as procedures, rules, documents describing the correct way, the way we should do things. And these are often created by people who may or may not have actual hands-on experience of doing the work. And it can, in some cases, be impossible to match the real-world conditions that people are actually working under. And it can often, in fact, be conflicting. So lots of people we work with in maternity departments, so maternity nurses and midwives, when they're conducting a procedure or when they're doing anything, most tasks have many different documents and policies and procedures that refer to that task and influence how that task should be done. Many cases it's more than 100. Sometimes it's more than 500 or something. So I mean, it's realistically impossible to adhere and comply with all those things, even know what all those things say. And many of those things conflict in one way or another. So what of course happens is that when someone does deviate, and of course they will always deviate in some way from that massive 500 set of policies, and something goes wrong, then the finger is easily pointed to that person and to say they didn't comply with that policy over there. So let's get we're taking a bit of a diversion. Let's come back. It can be impossible to match the real world conditions. And there's even Taiichi Ono, the founder of Toyota, or the CEO of Toyota, succumbed to this idea when he once issued that people should operate more than one machine at once on this production line, and he hadn't carried out the Genretsu and gone to the production line to see how it was actually done. And if he had done, he would have observed how difficult it is to operate more than one of these machines at a time. And so he had to in the end, on because of pushback from the operators, he had to reverse that decision. So the point is that prescription can help standardize work, but also over-reliance on prescriptions and checklists and things like that can hinder adaptability and even give authorities and judges in some way to find a cause for failure, which actually isn't the real cause, and they can give people a path to blame. Now, we should also look at work as disclosed. After all, this work as disclosed is what people say they do, how people describe we work, how we describe how a job is done. And this is shaped by psychological safety to a degree. often when we describe how we do work, we may omit certain details. We may simplify the task or skip over certain bits. And this might be because we're describing work to a layperson who doesn't, if a heart surgeon was to describe to me how they do a heart transplant, they're going to skip some details because I have no idea what they're talking about a lot of the time. So necessarily they're going to skip over some of the more complex or complicated details and terminology. Or we may skip details and gloss over things or omit to mention things that we fear may be judged negatively. So maybe if a machine, a particular machine doesn't always work right or never works right, and we have to use a screwdriver to get it to start or something like that, we're going to skip over that because we don't want to disclose that we might get in trouble for doing so, even though that's just how we have to do the job, because that's the real world. And so work is disclosed relies heavily on trust and openness and psychological safety in order to capture an appropriate and accurate picture of what the real world of what work is done actually looks like. So the less psychological safety we have, the bigger the gap is between work is disclosed and work is imagined and work is done in the real world. Now, work is done is the actual on the ground reality of the job. It's if we think about local rationality, it's defined or at least influenced by context, by time pressure, environment, resources, fatigue, our colleagues, our history, what is normalized. Think about normalization of deviance and things like that, and it will differ dramatically, significantly from imagined, prescribed, and disclosed in different ways. And so the real world, real life experience of people at the sharp end of work, such as a frontline worker, a nurse, a driver, or a teacher, may almost certainly will differ significantly from the way we prescribe work or imagine that job to look like. And the challenge, of course, here is at the bigger that gap between the way we imagine work and the way work is prescribed and the way it's actually done in the real world, the bigger that gap, the more danger we're in. The more danger we're in of things going wrong in practice, and the more difficult it is to improve work. After all, how can we improve work if we don't actually know how it's done in practice, how it's done in the real world? We might be improving policies, procedures, and documents that don't reflect reality. And of course, what that means is that we're ever widening the gap. There's a drift apart of these two worlds of work is imagined and work is done. Other reasons for this gap existing is that there's sometimes a lack of actual frontline input when creating procedures and policies and guidance documents. There's maybe an overly idealistic assumptions by management and other people in authority, or by trainers or by supervisors, and an organizational culture, maybe a lack of psychological safety that discourages the feedback about, well, this policy is wrong, this policy can't work, or even maybe this law doesn't work in practice. And so if we shut down, if we suppress hearing that information, we'll always be under the impression that this is how work is done, but it actually looks like this. This gap between work is disclosed, work is imagined, work is done can be a real problem. So what do we do to fix this? How do we improve it? Right. Firstly, is observe and ask and have conversations and discussions. Genshi Genbetsu, go and see the work and direct observation on to what's actually happening and involve people in that. Foster psychological safety to increase the honesty in work is disclosed. And ask many people. Run simulations, run observations, and continuously revise the work is prescribed to reflect what's realistically possible. Constantly try and pull back that work is prescribed and work is sort of policies, procedures, documentation. Continuously try to draw that back as close as possible, iteratively towards how work is done in the real world, how work actually looks like. So I hope this sheds a bit of light on what we mean by work as imagined and work as done. There's real important. This applies to almost every field, from technology to healthcare to safety to manufacturing and aviation and everything. It's one of the most interesting concepts to come out of the world of safety and be applied broadly across other domains as well. Really important to understand this gap and acknowledge that this gap exists and how and what we need to do to close this gap. We're never going to get complete parity on how we think work is imagined is what we imagine work to be and what it looks like in the real world. We're never going to get that perfectly aligned, but there is constantly a pull, a drift apart. So we need to consciously draw those two things together. So yeah. One of the ways of doing that is to foster greater psychological safety, enable the discussions to take place. So I'd love to hear what you think, what this looks like in your world, what work is imagined and work is done looks like in your practice, how you've managed to close that gap. And if you'd like to, well, I'd love it if you'd like to subscribe and like and share and do all that stuff. Head over to psychsafety.com for more information about work is done and work is imagined, as well as loads of other stuff about psychological safety and the world of work. And yeah, drop me a line at tom@psychsafety.com if you'd like to find out any more, or attend any of our training, or get some more of our resources and all that sort of stuff. And I'll see you next time.